What's up, everybody? This is Peter X Disselkoffer. Welcome to the Level Up the Personal Branding podcast, and today's another episode of Trios. Today we're doing the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and the Who, what I call the Big Three from the British invasion. And over, on my channel going forward, I'll be looking at the Beatles in different ways going forward. Classic albums, maybe some songs, and whatnot, and branding in several different contexts. But essentially, the Beatles were, early on they had a brand, everybody was shocked they had long hair and they were rebels. And that quickly, went away as, more rebellious bands, such as, the Rolling Stones and the Doors came along. And then the Beatles kind of became mainstream. But yeah, the Beatles were, they let the music speak for themselves. I think, I talk about, let your art speak for yourself, in that ZZ Top episode. And that's really what the Beatles did. They didn't spend a whole lot of time worrying about how they looked or whatnot. And even, even later in their career, I would say, post the Revolver album, they would just, I'll just say, give some interesting names to some of their songs. It was definitely interesting what they did. So they had, titles like Obla Di, Obla Da, and, I think the Old Brown Shoe, stuff like that, you wouldn't necessarily think would become a hit song or get radio airplay, but, they were the Beatles, they could get away with it. I have a whole list of, a checklist of what makes a song great and sort of to do and not to do or try to do, and the Beatles were so good they didn't have to adhere to that list. And of course I've done the rise and the fall of rock and roll, but the Beatles are exempt from that a little bit, even though their numbers aren't what they used to be when streaming compared to record sales. But the Beatles aren't going anywhere because boomers still consider them rock. In today's context, they're more considered pop. And John Lennon, used when referring to the Beatles, used the term pop and rock interchangeably. So I know that irritates some boomers when people talk about the Beatles being a pop band, and there's definitely a rivalry between the Beatles, the Stones, and the Who. Now, much more friendlier, I think, with the Stones. But I think Roger Daltrey and Pete Townsend basically said the Beatles really weren't a rock band, they were a pop band. And, they stand now in history as, one of the great architects of pop music and pop songs. So, things evolve. As I've said, I've done a couple episodes, where Elvis Presley is discussed, and now Elvis is, essentially the king of rockabilly. He's not, he still has the title of king of rock and roll, but, being realistic, he's the king of rockabilly. And of course, Michael Jackson took the king of pop, so the Beatles can have that, but the Beatles never hung a title on themselves because they didn't have to. They were that good. As I said, in my I think All Things Music, the Rise and Fall of the album, the Beatles were essentially, they created, the modern greatness of the album, and what an album should be and what you should strive for. I mean, certainly I think it starts with Help, uh, then Rubber Soul, and what's that, Revolver, Sergeant Pepper, So, I mean, the Beatles, started, basically experimented early on and found a formula of how to make great albums, and so they really are the uh, the architects and the you know uh, the fathers, for lack of a better term, of the album. So I mentioned earlier the Rolling Stones and their relationship with the Beatles. I mean, they, Paul McCartney and Mick Jagger's been sniping a little bit over the last few years. I think Paul, lobbed a grenade at the, here. Well, here's the, the Beatles and the Stones got along. They hung out together. The Stones actually covered a Beatles song early on that was written by the Beatles very early on, even before um, Satisfaction and Get Off Your Cloud. And they would always coordinate their releases. So they would always coordinate their releases so they weren't conflicting. So, essentially they were friends, but, hey, sometimes friends, become rivals. And, I think during the pandemic, Paul said the I can't remember what satanic the Majesty's Satanic album, the '67 album from the Stones. They basically said that the Stones were trying to copy Sergeant Pepper, and that album was decent, and the answer to that is no, they weren't trying to. Um, they were, everybody was doing a little bit of psychedelic, and the Stones did it in their own style and fashions. But no, they were not. One of the criticisms that Beatles fans, lob on the Stones is, hey, they weren't, pushing the envelope as far as creativity. But the Stones never. That was not their thing. They never, you know, claim to be, hey, we're gonna blow your mind, with all this new stuff every album. I mean, they were just like, what, we just love playing blues, and that's what we're gonna do. So, yeah, so that's the backstory on the Stones and the Beatles relationship. Early on, the Stones manager, is the Beatles broke first, and the Stones manager decided he was consciously going to brand off of the Beatles. So the Beatles were these nice, squeaky clean guys, and the Stones were the bad boys. Well, in reality, I mean, Bill Wyman was a little older. He wasn't a bad boy, the bass player. Um, uh, uh, Charlie Watts was older, and he was not a wild guy. He was not anything but a bad boy. And Brian Jones was a piece of work. I'll just let you look up Brian Jones and his background. I mean, bad boys are supposed to be lovable, and I don't know. Brian Jones definitely has some issues, but he is the founder of the Stones. So let's get that straight. I mean, he put the ad out. He brought the people in. Um, so he is the legitimate founder of the Rolling Stones. Keith Richards is a true bad boy. Mick, Mick Jagger plays the role of a bad boy really good, but he's actually, pretty. He kind of plays off of Keith a lot, and Keith and Mick have had an up and down relationship over the years, and they were coined the Glimmer Twins in the early '70s. I'm not sure why that was, but some of the biographers say that every once in a while Mick gets a little peeved at, or I mean, Keith gets a little peeved at Mick because he thinks he's kind of mooching and off of his bad boy image, or trying to be a bad boy, or trying to, mirror his bad boyness, and when he's not. So the Stones played up this bad boy image to the hilt. I mean, the Beatles were light, the Stones were dark. But in reality, the Stones were more upper class, and the Beatles were more working class. That's the strange. Um, but the Stones can make it work because I mean, Brian Jones was a piece of work. Keith was a true bad boy, and Mick had bad boy qualities, but could certainly play the role of a bad boy. Now, is he a true bad boy? I mean, that's a complicated question. I don't, you know, I'm not sure. Um, but most people, really consider the first great rock song to be "I Can't Get No Satisfaction," which hit number one in the U.S. in '65. Now, similar to that is "You Really Got Me" by the Kinks that hit number seven in the U.S. in 1964. But those are really the two first rock and roll sounding songs, if you ask me. I think the in some ways, the Beatles, used albums. They had great songs or whatever, but it's their albums that kind of blew people away and what they were doing with the albums. The Stones, made their mark more with, even though they did do very good albums, they made their mark more with songs, and it was, um, I Can't Get No Satisfaction, but for me was Painted Black. I think that was '66 when the Stones dropped that, because that was a really dark song, and nobody had ever heard anything like, Painted Black before. And I'm just thinking, I mentioned this in another podcast. I mean, I wonder what ran through the minds of the members of Black Sabbath the first time they heard Painted Black, because they have to be like, yeah, that's what I want to do. That's the sound. So, they had different influences, the Stones and the Beatles. The Beatles and the Stones come from different trees of rock and roll, or they have different lineage, because the Beatles really come out of the rockabilly. I mean, they're Elvis and Chuck Berry, big time. And the Stones are, they're coming out of blues. I mean, they're Muddy Waters. They're coming out of B.B. King, Albert King, and Freddie King, and that lineage of rock and roll. I mean, there's the two main ones, and so there is, so they're already diverging sound wise, and so yeah, I mean, as I said earlier, the Beatles constantly changed. They were pushing an envelope, and the Stones were different. I mean, you knew what you were going to get with the Stones. You're going to get some really good blues, and the Stones were a model of consistency. And in some ways, because you know, record companies today want to brand off your sound, and they want you to have that instantly recognizable sound. So when a new song hits, like, oh yeah, that's so and so. I mean, the Stones, I mean, they're a poster child for that. But yeah, I mean, I love the two bands. I think, my opinion, uh, I mean, greatest rock and roll bands, it's always in the polls, it's always the Beatles one, and the Stones two. And my opinion, though, they're a lot closer than people, give them credit for. Particularly when Paul McCartney took the shot at, you know, the Stones copying Sergeant Pepper. Um, Mick shot back and said, yeah, the Beatles weren't around. We in the '60s we played those 5, 6, 7, 8,000 seat venues, and in the '70s and the '80s we were playing, NFL football stadiums and soccer stadiums. And the Beatles never did that, and I was like, oh, because essentially what Mick was saying is, you know, take out, Kiss and their pyrotechnics and Motley Crue and their pyrotechnics and Alice Cooper and his show and we're the best live band, rock band in history. Now I said rock band. I'm not, Michael Jackson, Prince, James Brown, different category. I was like, yep, okay. You just closed the gap there. So, but rivalries are good. And I think, the Beatles or the Stones are very wise in how they branded off of the Beatles. I can't blame them. I thought, they played that very well. So, yeah. Me personally, I think I actually prefer the Stones, earlier albums when, going head to head with the Beatles because I don't know if I mentioned this, but if you go back, I think I mentioned this in the rise and fall of rock and roll, but the difference is, between, going back to the founders of rock and roll in the 50s, the rockabilly oftentimes were, in their guys in their late 20s writing teeny bopper lyrics to teeny boppers. And the blues guys were writing to adults and writing adult lyrics and writing, adult themes. And in some ways, I think the early Beatles were a little bit, I Want to Hold Your Hand and She Loves You. I love the songs, very well written. There's a little bit of element of that, of the 60s rockabilly side, and whereas the Stones were straight blues from the jump. I mean, they were like, better hide your daughters. We're coming, so, and that was part of the branding, but that was just, part of the Stones being the Stones, too. So, yeah, so where does The Who fit in? Well, first of all, The Who also comes out of the rockabilly, the Elvis, Chuck Berry wing of rock and roll. Some people, I just been working on the punk ethos. Some people consider The Who to be the first punk band, and they were true rebels, all four of them. They were the first band as rebels, because as I said, there were some rebels and the Stones and Bad Boys, but the Who they were the real deal. They were real bad boys. I mean, Jim Morrison of the Doors is probably the baddest of the bad boys of the 60s, but all four of the Who were bad boys. They walked it and they talked it. They were rowdy. They would destroy their equipment. Yeah. So, I mean, I can't, my generation, their first big hit, they had a lot of punk elements because they were defining themselves and setting themselves apart from, their parents and past generations. The Doors did that a little bit with 5 to 1 a couple years later. But yeah, so I mean, the Who definitely had to find their own niche, and they decided they were going to go, you have the good boy Beatles, and in the middle you have the Stones, and they're like, okay, we'll just go on the other side of the Stones. I mean, we're comfortable being, the true bad boys. So, yeah. One of the interesting things about the Who, the primary songwriter in the Who is Pete Townsend, and from very early on, Pete, was doing concept albums. I mean, even in his early 20s, and the one thing I can say about the Who is every album has gotten better, and even though, they've done albums in the 2000s and they really haven't commercially, they haven't hit. One of the reasons is because of the rock and roll isn't as relevant, but every album by the Who has been better than the last, and Pete Townsend has been pretty committed to concept albums and writing songs with meaning. So the Beatles were, the sound that propelled the rock and roll in the 60s. To quote Reggie Jackson, they were kind of the straw that stirred the drink. Everybody watched them. If you go back and read the effect Sgt. Pepper had on their fellow musicians, the Stones and the Who included, that was a landmark album, and so everybody kind of watched the Beatles to see what they were going to do. Most everybody. I mean, the Stones were curious, but the Stones were steady and stayed, true to being a blues band, so they weren't going to change. But they were curious, but everybody else was watching the Beatles, and whereas the Stones and the Who, they were the attitude that drove rock in the 60s. I mean, that's what rock was, classic rock. And, they were, these three are the foundation of classic rock. And it was based on attitude. I don't know, I kind of question whether they were rebels, but they certainly were, had an attitude, and the Stones and the Who personified that attitude. So the Beatles from '64, and then they broke up in '70, '71. It's interesting. The Who kind of, they had a couple hits in the '60s, but they kind of struggled. They really, in the I think it was '68, maybe even '69 when they finally broke through, and they were it was the Stones versus the Who and Led Zeppelin in the '70s, and yeah, there's also a very intense rivalry between the Who and Led Zeppelin in the '70s. Two of the most outspoken members in the rock community, I would never hold back on their opinions, is Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones and Pete Townsend of the Who. They don't bite their tongue about other musicians and what they think, and I don't agree with all of them, but they don't bite their tongue. Now, interestingly enough, I mean, Pete Townsend, basically accuses Led Zeppelin of ripping off their sound. Whatever the live album, I can't think of with a live album that they did in the late '60s. But when you listen to the sound of that album, how they use reverb and how they reverb, which is echo, and how they mix and pan stuff around. I kind of have to agree with them, but again, borrowing someone else's sound, that's Pete Townsend. I mean, Led Zeppelin's a great band, so yeah. I mean, they're a Hall of Fame band, Led Zeppelin. They deserve to be Led Zeppelin. All the accolades they get, but if you're gonna, I agree with Pete Townsend, but I think the blues, these blues artists that had their songs borrowed and reworked and never got credit for them, at least for a while. And Jimmy Page, I forgot to give them credit, or I forgot, that this song was a derivative of that song is more of a problem than kind of borrowing the Who's mixing board stuff. But Pete's right, and Pete, Mr. Townsend has opinions. He's entitled to them, and in this one, I'm not arguing with his conclusion. And he has every right to take shots if he wants to, and he will take shots. So the big three, I call them the big three because they are the the three biggest bands from the British invasion. Personally, I think the Doors are right there with them, and I think the Doors streaming numbers show that. As far as the other British invasion bands, the Kinks are there, but those are still the top three. Nothing against the Kinks, good band, but they're not there with the Beatles, the Stones, and the Who. And they branded off of each other, and at least with the the Beatles and Stones, they for the most part were friendly, got along. Now and in the last few years, every once in a while they have a public spat, but and for the most part, the Stones and the Who got along too. But I think the second big spat between the Beatles and the Stones was on this tour earlier this year that the Stones was doing. Paul McCartney said the Stones were nothing but a cover band, and then he said, well, later he said that was taken out of context, but Roger Daltrey, the lead singer, who was like, yep, he's right, the Stones were definitely a blues cover band, which is interesting, but interesting enough. I mean, Pete Townsend and Keith Richards, for all their opinionated views, they respect each other. So yeah, I mean, they came up, they branded off each other. All three of them were rivals, but every once in a while words are traded, but there's respect between the three of them, and even if Pete Townsend and Roger Daltrey do not think the Stones, or the Beatles are a rock group and they're a pop group. Hey, numbers don't lie, and their historical imprint is very strong on the music industry. So yeah, been waiting to do this episode for a while. This has been fun. As I said, I'll be doing some more stuff on the Beatles. No, the Beatles aren't underrated. They deserve all the accolades they get. They earned it. They were great songwriters, and I'll be looking at different aspects of the Beatles, as I progress and get deeper on different topics on the channel. So with that, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, check out my own music, kind of working on my, mixing my fifth album, got 4 here, and then fiddle around here on YouTube and got some nice playlists that will group the songs by theme and different things like that. And I also have my 2 science fiction fantasy novels and 1 novella on Amazon, so check that out. But thanks for coming through. Appreciate your time, and keep checking this out. I got plenty of more stuff coming. So thanks again.